Hello, my name is Nezumi, and this is how I made the climbing axes from Shadow of the Tomb Raider. First, I made the pattern in Adobe Illustrator, and then I could print that out and trace it onto one layer of Warbler. The Warbler will be the main base for the axes to give it structure. My Warbler looks like this because I made it from a bunch of scraps that I heated back up together. Anyway, you can heat the Warbler up a little bit and then cut it out. Next, I cut that pattern out of 1mm craft foam, twice for each axe. And using contact cement, glue the foam to both sides of the Warbler. Apply the contact cement to both sides and let it dry completely before sticking them together. And you can use parchment paper or normal paper to block off the areas you don't want to glue yet. And I found it easier to cut the serrated edges of the blade after I glued it all down. And to make sure I cut it right, I would just cut one side first and then glue the other side down and then cut it again. The blades themselves are only made out of one layer of Warbler and 2 layers of the 1mm craft foam. And as I went, I just kept cutting my pattern piece down and tracing it onto different thicknesses of craft foam. The main part of the handle got a layer of 5mm craft foam for each side. And to add more stability to the axe, I cut out a groove. To do this, you cut into the foam diagonally, creating a V shape, and then take the foam out. Be careful not to cut all the way through. And then glue and wire into that groove. And it should look something like this. And like before, cover both parts in contact cement and then glue it down. And for the grip, I cut out more pieces out of craft foam. I used a mixture of 5, 3, and 1mm craft foam for this. And for the bolts on the handle, I found little beads in my stash that looked just like it. And then you can glue those on. I had 1mm on each side of the blade itself, and the handle had 5mm and 1mm on each side of the blade. And the grip itself had 2 to 3 layers on each side. Though depending on how big your hands are, you might want to make the grip thicker than I did. Now you can start dremeling the seams down to make it all blend in together. And make sure to wear a respirator, and I kept a vacuum nearby to vacuum up all the dust. I also very carefully dremeled down the serrated edge of the blade to make it appear sharp. After I was done dremeling, I took a hand sander and sanded down the edges even more to make it smooth. And here's how it looked after sanding. Next, I lightly hit it with a heat gun on a low setting. This will seal the foam and get rid of any of that sanding dust. Just be careful not to heat it up too much, especially on the 1mm craft foam, because you could burn or shrink it. And now I could glue on those little beads. In my reference, there were 3 bolts on each side of the climbing axe, so I cut that out of 5mm craft foam. And I found that sequins kind of looked a little bit like a bolt, so I glued that on top with super glue. And then I glued those on with contact cement. And finally, I made the blade on the smaller side of the axe. I just made a little pattern on my axe, and then I cut that out of Warbler. I taped together a few popsicles to get the right width I needed, and then I heated up the Warbler and shaped it over that. And once it cooled down, I could pop it off and then glue it onto the axe with contact cement. Finally, using quick seal, I filled in any seams and gaps, and I just used my finger and water to blend it all out. And for some of the smaller parts, like the holes, I used a sculpting tool to blend out the quick seal. And then I covered the whole thing in a few layers of Mod Podge, and later I covered it in a few layers of white gesso because I wanted to sand it down a little bit more. And then I gave it a few coats of Rust-Oleum Sandable primer. I did sand it a little bit more after this, and then one more coat of the primer. It was really tricky getting rid of all the seam lines. If you do have access to a laser cutter, I would highly recommend it. And then I spray painted it red first. And for the blades and the handle, I gave those a few coats of black acrylic paint. Then I painted the blades and the bolts silver, and taking a darker red, I started weathering the axe. And taking an even darker red, I started painting in the shadows. And I used a mixture of weathering and stippling painting techniques to get the desired worn effect. And using silver paint, I painted on spots where it would look like the paint was chipped off. And off screen I did the same thing to the blades and the handle, adding weathering, dirt, and shadows. Then I gave the entire thing a few coats of satin spray varnish. Then I took twill tape and painted it with watered down acrylic paint. This will give it that worn and dirty look. Once that was dried, I could hot glue it around the handle. And here's the finished climbing axe. And then I just attached the two to a red carabiner and attached it onto my costume. And here's what it looked like when I was wearing it. Thank you so much for watching, and please check out the other videos on how I made the costume. Please subscribe, like, and follow for more.